At 6 in the morning, the world is supposed to be soft, blue, forgiving, a thin ribbon of cold air sneaking under the door, the coffee sighing on the counter. But that Tuesday, I stepped out to a wall of chrome and steel and diesel heat. Two long bed monsters jammed across my garage like they'd been airdropped by a careless god, engines still pinging as they cooled, oil already spidering into the hairline cracks of my concrete. And across the property line, framed in her kitchen window like a theater villain who knows the second act is hers, Whitney Hale lifted a mug to her lips and smiled like she'd just taken my queen while I was still moving a pawn. My name is Graham Porter. I'm 52, and I spent 28 years turning stubborn metal into motion at a Ford dealership. Before my back, my knees, and the calendar made other plans. I live in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, a high plain town that wears sunrise like a badge and wind like a scar, and I keep a roof over my head. Because I rent my detached 3-bay to the Pine County Sheriff's Office, a legal agreement, notarized and filed, where Deputy Julian Vega comes by twice a week for tactical gear and emergency equipment, keeps everything neat, signs the ledger, gives my shepherd bear a knuckle scratch, and goes. And if you think that sounds dull, you haven't met Whitney. She slid into our neighborhood 6 months back with the kind of landscaping company that arrives like an army and parks like an invasion, and within a week she'd secured herself a seat on the Cedar Ridge Bluffs HOA, the kind of board that says, enhance property values, but means do it my way. And by noon on her first lawn decor crackdown day, her rigs, one bristling with mowers and spreaders, the other a personal pickup that could tow a barn by glaring at it, were settled across my driveway like they'd found religion, and I said, calmly, neighborly, this is private property. Deputy Vega has a scheduled check this afternoon, and Whitney said, without looking up from a clipboard, it's overflow parking, Graham. One afternoon won't kill anyone. Which turned into 6 hours and a DJ thumping so hard the bass chased the photos off my hallway nail like they were rats leaving a sinking ship. When Deputy Vega arrived, he parked 2 blocks down, walked the long way around like a pro who's been trained not to roll his eyes in public, and I apologized 3 times. And it was the worst I'd felt since the day the oncologist said the words I've never learned how to say without tasting tin, because Nora, my wife, my quiet North Star, was gone 3 years by then, and the house that felt too big for one man felt even bigger when the bills came like weather, relentless and unblinking. And that garage lease, $400 a month, wasn't a windfall, it was oxygen. I stared at Whitney's trucks, at the oil on my floor that wasn't mine, at the HOA notice she'd already drafted, $2,000. For unauthorized commercial activity, a phrase so smug it wore cologne. And something inside me slid into a different gear, because I can be patient, I can be careful, but I am also a man who spent half a lifetime listening to machines tell the truth about people, and there's a sound to bullying, a whine that gets under your skin, and once you hear it everywhere. So I did what a mechanic does, what Nora always urged: document, measure, tighten the bolts of the story until it holds. Camera phone, timestamps, witness names, a spiral notebook thick enough to stop a small caliber round, and then county courthouse, that sunless archive that smells like dust and resignation, where Clerk Diane Rhodes peered over her glasses and said, softly, like she was letting me in on a family recipe, your garage predates the HOA by 15 years, Mr. Porter. That's called grandfathered use. The words settled in my bones like fuel, because I hadn't known, not for sure, that time could be a defense, that what I'd built with my own hands before some committee found its stamp could stand taller than bylaws written after the concrete set. And since fairness, like faith, travels better with a companion, I went hunting in the municipal code, the beast with 1,000 subsections, and there it was, plain as sun on snow. Any commercial vehicle over 10,000 pounds needs a permit to park overnight in residential zones. And a quick look at Whitney's spec sheets, the ones she'd left on her dashboard like theater programs, told me her rigs were heavy enough to have their own weather systems. Permits? 0. By Tuesday night, the community center smelled like burnt coffee and nervous antiperspirant, 5 folding chairs, and a table that had seen too many bake sales and not enough truth. Whitney centered like a judge and eager to hand down sentences. reciting section 4.3 as if it were scripture, and I let her finish, never interrupt a performance that is about to convict itself, and then I slid my papers across, deed dates circled in red, 1987 in a font size you could see from the parking lot. Cedar Ridge Bluffs HOA formed in 2002. And the air went out of the room so fast you could have bottled it. And Earl Benton, a retired postmaster who remembers when our cul-de-sacs were pasture, chuckled and said he remembered lemonade on the day my garage roof went on, and Whitney flushed from paper white to beet red to storm purple, and when I produced the weight ratings, the time-stamped photos of her rigs napping in front of my doors, the board voted 4-0 to void her notice and cite Whitney instead, and you could feel the tilt, that moment when a bully realizes the pavement is not a red carpet, it's gravel. The next morning, my mailbox was boxed in by those two rigs like they were reenacting a siege. An anonymous complaint about bear arrived at animal control as if my dog, who naps like a monk and barks like a gentleman, had joined a motorcycle gang, and by Friday, a letter, thick and official, stamped by Cedar Ridge Planning and Zoning, arrived, authored by concerned residents. Processed by Tara Pike, who, it turned out, was the daughter of Ellen Pike on our HOA board. Small towns are circles masquerading as grids, and I walked into that basement office that smells like industrial carpet and fluorescent fatigue, and Tara looked at me like I was an obligation she could hand to a different department, and I asked about home occupation permits, and I laid out the municipal code sections that speak softly but carry a heavy weight, and I showed photos of Whitney's client meetings at her dining table, equipment transfers from her driveway, and she went red, then pale, and said she couldn't discuss ongoing matters, which means, in City Hall language, this meeting is over, but the problem is not. 2 weeks later, the planning hearing packed like a church. On Easter, Whitney with a briefcase and the prim set of someone who believes performance equals proof, her husband Troy Hale staring at the floor like salvation might be hiding in the carpet. And when Chair Miles Harrigan asked for evidence, Whitney talked about residential character. And then I stood, slow, back straight, a habit from years bent over hoods, and said, Commission members, I agree that we must protect residential character, and that's exactly why this surprises me. And I laid out Whitney's violations one by one. No permit for a home business, commercial rigs. Too heavy by law, client consults at home, without zoning variances, and Tara passed a file to the commission that looked suspiciously like it had been assembled quickly and correctly after a guilty conscience met a rule book, and the vote was 5-0 to dismiss the complaint against me, while opening violations against Whitney, and when we walked out, victory smelled like cold air and diesel fading and, yes, fear, not mine. That was when the insurance claim appeared, a paper grave marker planted in my driveway, alleging Deputy Vega had scraped Whitney's fence during a routine pickup, damage totaling $3,500. Photographs so professional they looked like they'd auditioned for a crime show. And because I have learned that truth shows up in places people forget to dust, I walked over, bare trotting, and I smelled paint thinner, saw ruler-straight scuffs at bumper height, too uniform to be chaos, and across the street Dorothy Finch, 78 and sharper than a box cutter, called out that she'd seen Whitney working the fence with a can the night before, which would have been laughable if it weren't so expensive, and when Neil Carver, an insurance investigator with a camera that could probably photograph fingerprints on starlight, arrived, he said the magic words, hand tools, not impact, and Dorothy's Ring camera produced video of Whitney painting damage lines at 6:47 p.m., more than 12 hours after Deputy Vega had been anywhere near my driveway. And when Neil showed Whitney the footage, she went from prosecutor to defendant so fast you could feel the suction, withdrew the claim before lunch, and rumor did the rest. You want to believe that kind of humiliation cools a person down. It doesn't, it boils them harder. And by the next dawn, I found motor oil poured across my driveway in a slick that smelled like a garage fire, the mailbox wobbling because someone had loosened its bolts, my garden hose slashed in 3 places, Bear's water bowl stinking of bleach, and that was when I stopped using a notebook and started using a coalition. Dorothy hosted in her kitchen. Mrs. Ellison from Maple Street brought noise complaint letters about her ancient AC. Earl arrived with HOA minutes underlined like scripture. Caleb Harper from the diner said Whitney had been talking property turnover with contractors. And Tony Calder, who runs the hardware store, mentioned Whitney coming in for motion sensors and barrier orders. And our quiet became purpose. Our fear became angles. And our cameras, our timestamps. Our affidavits piled up until their weight had geography. Then came the morning when a kitchen 3 blocks over caught fire, smoke curling into the cold like an accusation, and the engines rolled. Fast and hard. Only to find unauthorized construction barriers forcing them to haul hoses an extra 100 yards. And Chief Nolan Price looked like a man who'd been punched in the face when he traced the barriers to a supplier who sells mostly to landscaping firms. And interference with emergency services is not a phrase that reads like a fine, it reads like prison, and somewhere between that fire and the next sunset, Whitney slid an envelope under my door thick with photographs of my daily routine, Bear's walking times, and a couple of shots taken at my kitchen window through a lens. That cost more than honesty, and I understood that the storm wasn't circling anymore. It was over the house, and it was time. It was a Sunday that felt like the pause between thunder and the crack. Wind quiet, the town holding its breath, when the back gate latch clicked and Whitney walked in like she'd been invited, pressed khakis and a polo, what a TV consultant would call trustworthy. Suburban. And Bear slid between us with that low sound he makes when danger is pretending to be polite, and Whitney smiled that realtor's smile and said, "Graham, let's clear the air." And she held up a manila envelope that sagged with cash like a grocery bag full of apples. I hit record on my phone because Rebecca Vega, Deputy Julian's sister and a legal aid attorney, had taught me that when you're dealing with people who believe rules are a suggestion, documentation isn't backup, it's ballast. And Whitney said $20,000 to terminate your lease. Clean break, no hard feelings, and I asked why a lawful agreement that brings the sheriff through our neighborhood twice a week would be a problem for anyone who cares about safety and property values, and Whitney leaned in the way a card sharp does when she's about to turn over all 4 aces and whispered about development opportunities, about removing obstacles, about my corner lot being commercially promising, if only certain complications disappeared. Her voice syrupy, her eyes hard, and when I didn't jump at the bait, she flipped the hook, mentioned connections at City Hall, county planning, even the state commission, said life could get very difficult for people who weren't reasonable about progress. And then, as if she'd been given a script by the devil and told to read it into a good microphone, she glanced at Bear and said accidents happen in neighborhoods where people aren't cooperative. Here's what fear does when it's awake inside you. It gets very quiet. It stands up straight. It takes notes. I told Whitney I'd think about it, asked to keep the cash overnight, and watched her leave with that satisfied predator's smile. And then I stared at the envelope, at Bear, at the scuffed place on my floor where oil had tried to write its name, and I realized the story I was in had an ending. And it could be ugly, or it could be just. But either way it would be loud. Town council night. The chamber overflowing, doors propped open, kids on tiptoe, Channel 12 cameras struggling to find the angle, reporter Val Reyes whispering into a mic with her producer counting down on fingers, and I arrived early with a briefcase that weighed more than a torque wrench set, Rebecca at my side with that quiet blade-in-the-sleeve composure that people mistake for kindness until it's time to speak. And our neighbors, Dorothy, Earl, Mrs. Ellison, Tony, Caleb, and a dozen more, lined the back wall with tablets and printouts in their own small storms of resolve. Deputy Julian Vega spoke first, facts in a line, a months-long ledger of harassment stacked like bricks, property damage, environmental dumping, impersonation of HOA authority, and the big one, obstruction of emergency access. And when Mayor Allison Grant nodded, I stood and didn't try to dress it up. I just pressed play, and Whitney's voice filled the chamber. Like smoke, the offer, the amount, the connections, the implied threats, the explicit one to Bear. And there was a sound then that I won't forget, a single collective intake of breath like a town, getting ready to either fight or run. And Chief Price followed, jaw a straight line, explaining how much time 100 yards steals from a fire hose, from a life. Whitney came forward with an attorney who looked expensive in a way that says win or bill triple. And when Mayor Grant asked if she wanted to respond, the attorney tugged at Whitney's sleeve, but pride is a faulty governor. And Whitney started talking about positive change, And way in the back, Earl stood and read from HOA minutes where Whitney had labeled longtime residents, obstacles, and budgeted for accelerated turnover. And then he held up receipts for construction barriers, and across the aisle Tony lifted a sales log, and Dorothy, with perfect timing, held a tablet high with a paused ring clip of Whitney painting damage. When the gavel finally found wood, Mayor Grant said the council would cooperate fully with the county investigation, and DA Howard Laramie stepped up, crisp and cold as a new blade, and said, "Ms. Hale, you're under arrest, and there's a sound handcuffs make when justice isn't theoretical. It's here, it's metal, it's appropriate." And for a second I didn't breathe. And then I did. People think that's the end, the cuff click, the cheer, the hero shot on the 6 o'clock. But life is not a montage. It's a carburetor. It needs the right air and the right fuel and the right spark in the right order. So for weeks after, there were interviews and affidavits. There were whispers and reconciliations. There was Troy Hale loading a truck in the dusk looking 10 pounds lighter in the soul. And there was me, in my kitchen, setting Nora's mug down soft. The house suddenly quiet enough to hear forgiveness circling like a bird that isn't sure it can land yet. And then the letters changed tone, as if the town had exhaled, because the Pine County Sheriff's Office came back with a proposal to expand the lease, $1,000 a month if I'd let fire and rescue share a bay for emergency response gear, and a little closet space for a new community outreach coordinator, which meant my tax reassessment nightmare, the one Whitney had tried to weaponize, with anonymous claims about commercial conversion, had less bite and less audience, because math and sunlight are old friends, and the county commission approved it, and the checks settled the way good engines do, quietly, predictably, on time. The courtroom was smaller than TV promises, fluorescent bulbs making everyone look fragile, and Whitney came in with the energy of a person who has been told the plea is the only bridge left standing. And after DA Laramie stacked the evidence in a narrative so tight the edges squeaked, extortion, environmental crimes, interference with emergency services, a little constellation of fraud, she said guilty in a voice that made you think of teeth cracking ice, and the judge gave her 18 months in county and 5 years probation, and a cost ledger that looked like a cliff. Her company folded before the leaves did, her sign came down, the website redirected to nothing, and the house next door, white trim, neat hedges. The scene of so much invented authority, sold to Evan and Mara Collins, 2 teachers who bake cookies like they're running for office and asked to borrow my ladder even when I'd offer before they finished the sentence, and their twin girls discovered that Bear is a pushover for belly rubs and, against all shepherd stereotypes, tolerates tiaras. We threw a block party that wasn't really about burgers or the kids climbing the fire engine, but about the way a neighborhood breathes when it's not bracing, and the sheriff's department made Bear an honorary K-9 with a bad-shaped name tag that made him sit a little taller like he understood the ceremony, and Earl ran for HOA president on a platform of transparency, term limits, and recorded meetings, and he won so easily it felt like the town voting for sleep, and one of his first acts was to fund an emergency preparedness program instead of yet another round of photocopied threats. Rebecca took our documentation system, the cameras, the timestamps, the affidavits lined up like spark plugs, and built a toolkit for other towns, and the calls started coming from places with names that sound like novels and old songs. And I set up the Nora Porter Memorial Scholarship, small but steady, for kids who want to go into nursing, teaching, social work, law enforcement, the jobs that stitch towns back together when somebody's pulled too hard on the seams. And the first recipient was Marisol Vega, Deputy Julian's niece, headed to nursing school with a smile that could turn on a light. The street changed in the quiet ways that matter most. Dorothy's garden parties turning into weekly check-ins where no one pretended the bad days never happened, but no one let them run the room either. Mrs. Ellison organizing morning walks that were really disguised wellness checks. Tony putting a small board by the register where people could post needs, lawn help, a ride to the clinic, someone to watch a kid for an hour. And a morning came, 6 months to the week after the cuffs, when I was trimming roses in Nora's garden and laughter spilled over the fence like a radio tuned to human, and I looked up and saw those twins draping a string of plastic pearls on Bear, and he looked back at me like, "Sorry, I took an oath. There is a way a town feels when it believes in itself again, when the air isn't weighted by unsent emails and doorbell alerts and the suspicion that your neighbor is building a case with your lawn as Exhibit A. And Cedar Ridge felt like that. Lighter, brighter, like the wind was finally just wind. It is a modest miracle, and I know better than to pretend I made it alone, because no mechanic worth his grease thinks one wrench solves every problem. It takes a shop. The last loose end, if you can call a boulder a loose end, was the property tax reassessment Whitney had tried to bend into a weapon by whispering commercial conversion. And when I went back to the assessor with the expanded county lease, the grandfathered use clause, and the real numbers, the appeal process, which often moves like molasses uphill, found traction because truth had a recording and a paper. Rescue locker looked like safety, not danger. Do I wish Whitney had chosen to be a neighbor instead of an antagonist? That she'd parked her trucks somewhere legal and brought over brownies? That we discussed hedges instead of statutes? That her version of ambition didn't require my eviction, my silence, or my dog as collateral? Yes, of course, yes, because even after justice, anger is a low flame running in the back room of the heart, and it burns cleaner when you name it. But I also see the other ledger, the one Nora would have found first, the one that says a town. The block party with paper plates and an apology for not catching the rot sooner, and I told her what I believe even when it scares me. Predators thrive on silence and process, and the only answer is sunlight and persistence. You have to keep showing up with the receipts and the witnesses and the old man in the back who remembers lemonade on a hot day. And sometimes you also need a dog who makes. The Pine County Sheriff's Office and Fire and Rescue use my garage for work that keeps people breathing. Evan and Mara Collins host parent-teacher nights, and Lynn tools without a ledger. Bear sleeps by the fence with his badge on the hook because heroes also nap. The roses in Nora's garden are blooming again, stubborn and beautiful, and I talk to her when I water them. Tell her about the scholarship letters, the kids who write like the world is still worth learning, and maybe the wind that moves the leaves is just weather, but I like to think it's a nod. And yet, because stories are conjoined twins with questions, here's the part that won't leave me alone. We won because Whitney was sloppy, noisy, impatient, because she believed swagger could outpace evidence. But what happens in the towns where the bully is smarter, quieter, trained by a lawyer and a publicist? What happens when the barriers go up without a receipt, when the damage is inflicted by proxy, when people are too tired, too scattered, too scared to gather in a fluorescent room and say enough? That's where you come in. Call to action. In a fight like this, neighbors versus a self-interested machine, where do you draw the line between order and overreach, between property values and human values, between ambition and predation? Was Whitney Hale's sentence too harsh? Too light? Exactly right. Should a small town use its full weight, from HOA minutes to district attorneys, to defend the vulnerable, even when the vulnerable are not likable or organized or online? Drop your take below. Tell me your HOA horror story or your victory. Argue about process versus power, about dogs and dignity and due process. And if you've got a Cedar Ridge of your own, tell us how you held the line or how you plan to.